Well, welcome here to Locke on this beautiful spring day. Absolutely perfect weather conditions. I'm James Motlow. I have the unique experience of having lived here in Locke in the 1970s for about 10 years. I had been raised in Sacramento, knew a little bit about Locke, really didn't, but I knew a little bit. But just by a whim, I ended up renting a building at the end of Main Street here, and that began my unique time of living in Locke. I lived here during the 1970s, took a number of photographic images, then came back in the 1980s with my co-author Jeff Gillenkirk, and we did a series of oral histories that eventually we put together into a book that was published by the University of Washington in 1987 called Bitter Melon. It's still available. In fact, you can see it when we go into the boarding house museum. So that's a little bit about me. And from all this, from doing the book and just living here and hearing the various stories, and then my own kind of diving into the history of Locke, I'm here to tell you some of the most amazing stories of what makes this town so absolutely unique. I know if you look down here today, even during COVID, yeah, it's a little quieter. We don't see hardly anybody. And for most times when visitors come, this is what they see, this quiet little town. But it wasn't always like that. This town in, say, the 1920s, if you were to come here, this town, this street right here, if you're looking down this in the 1920s, you would see lights going back and forth. There were trees, cars were going both ways on this. You would see gas pumps here, there were markets. But there was a flood of people because of what was being offered here in Locke. You would see over maybe 1,000, 2,000 people here coming from all over, coming from San Francisco, Stockton, Sacramento. They'd come by riverboat, they would come by railroad, they would come by car, they would come to Locke because Locke had so much to offer them. You could enjoy all the kinds of social amenities that were available, say, in Chicago or later on Las Vegas, or if you were to go back in China at Macau. This was a combination of all of those. It was like Las Vegas, Macau, and Chicago all rolled into one. It was all happening here on this little main street. It was a remarkable time that flourished. And so, yes, and people still come by, they still drive in. We only have one-way traffic right now. We do have a parking lot behind, which you can see there, of where if you want to come down and visit Locke, please park in the parking lot. Hopefully you'll find a space. And we'll go into the museum. We're going to go over here to the Junsong School and down into the Dai Loy Museum and all these other places. But imagine what, not that it looks like now, but imagine it was at its heyday of when every single building was, sure, they had the restaurants and they had the ice cream parlors and you had the markets, you had the Incheon market, you had the Fan Hoop market, you had tofu that was made daily, you have the brothels, you have the speakeasies, you have the opium parlors, and then you have gambling. All that was happening here. This place was thriving with people. And that's what's exciting about this. This is why I get excited about telling the stories, because there are so many rich, amazing stories to be told about how this town comes to be. So the town, this was an orchard right here. This was all an orchard at one time. In 1915, a fire occurs, and actually I think it was October 7th in 1915, a fire breaks out in Walnut Grove. And it's kind of mysterious of how that fire breaks out. It was somewhat maybe possibly due to a kerosene heater getting tripped or something like that. There's also the possibility that it was caused by essentially warring tongs, so different people, different groups that controlled the various gambling establishments up and down the Delta here and in Stockton. So you have these various, the Bing Kong Tong, which was one of the major sources of enforcement and gambling such throughout the Delta here and into Stockton. So that's the other possibility of how this fire occurs in 1915 over in Walnut Grove. But in Walnut Grove, it's one of those unique things because we think of, various groups like the Chinese who came to America as a single group. But inside that group, that big body, you have different dialects that were being spoken. You had one group who spoke a particular dialect, and another group that spoke a different dialect. Well, one group was the majority of the Chinese. Another group was a minority of those Chinese groups, and that was the Cheongsong speaking group. They negotiated with the descendants of George W. Locke, who had purchased the acreage here, the orchard that became an orchard. He originally had cattle here. That was in the 1880s of when he bought this as kind of an investment. He was a very successful rug and blind merchant in Sacramento. He, along with a partner, buys a series of ranches as kind of just to, have other investments. Well, it's his grandchildren who then are approached by a group of businessmen all Cheongsong businessmen from Walnut Grove to build a town here. And that's the beginning of it. So in the early 1915, by December, you're beginning to see the layouts of the buildings. And it was done by white carpenters because the Chinese, the merchants, there's one very distinct merchant, Charlie Li Bing. But Charlie was kind of a attached name. His real name was Li Bing, Khan actually. And so that he was one of the major driving forces, and he establishes a number of the businesses here, but he also brings all the other merchants. And so you have the development of this town that begins in 1915 and stretches all the way to today, to where we can still come down and see this most remarkable, state, park in a sense. It is, on the National Register of Historical Landmarks, which I'll probably talk about more as we go into the Boarding House Museum and such, and talk about how we have a state park now here and how important that is for the preservation of the experience here in Locke by the Chinese and also many other groups that helped the entire Delta become this one of the richest agricultural areas in all of America. It really is all happening here. So, let us go through the town, let us go through the various, buildings, let us help you understand the experience that you have when you come here, as well as the various different personal stories that people can tell. And, of course, I got to promote my book a little bit. So if the Boarding House Museum, you'll find Bitter Melon there, which is the name of my book, which will help you understand more. So if you can use that book as a way to walk around the town and to see the stories that were possible here. You had movie theaters, you had the Star Theater, which we'll talk about. That once had the Chinese opera coming from San Francisco and performing here. What a remarkable town, what a remarkable place. And it's going to be great to share all of this with you. Well, now that we're leaving Main Street, we're coming into the Boarding House Museum here. It's actually a state-run park that is part of the state parks here in California. And it's a unique building in many ways, part of which you can kind of visually see about you. The Locke Foundation, which is very much a part of the co-operators of this space here, has put together a series of displays that somewhat changed. They have shows not only down here, but primarily upstairs. And so when you come to Locke, hopefully after post-COVID, and we have everything open for you, you'll use this as one of your main stops, if not maybe your first stop, because there is local parking that you can do, as well as to come here and to begin to get a little bit more knowledge of the Chinese experience here in the Delta, and primarily here in Locke, about that experience. To kind of give you a little bit of the uniqueness of this building. This building was started, I believe, in about 1911 by a Japanese family to operate as a boarding house here, to serve the workers who worked across the road here in what was the packing house, which packed primarily asparagus at that time. But then when the fire occurs in 1915, that forces the relocation of a particular group of Chinese who spoke a very particular dialect of Cantonese. And they negotiated with the landowners, the descendants of George W. Locke, to build the town here. Well, this building was, as I said, already existing. But the Chinese and the Japanese were very territorial at that time. Even though they lived together over in Walnut Grove, they still didn't, there was kind of a separation. Well, the same was true here in Locke. But what's funny about that was the people who had, the Chinese who had Locke, considered this building to be outside of town. It wasn't in the town of Locke, but it's only 20 feet away. It was always the weirdest thing. But so that was part of that. And so coming back to the Locke Foundation, though, we really encourage people, if you have descendants who were part of the experience here in Locke, or if they lived elsewhere in the Delta, to use the Locke Foundation as a source to possibly look at sharing something from your ancestors who had particular, like, workbooks or, you know, pay stubs, or even their own stories. The Locke Foundation does have an oral history project that we really encourage people who have anything to do with the Delta to come and talk and tell us their stories, so that in the future, all these stories can be readily available, just like this, this video that we're doing now. So yeah, come and take a look at all this. You know, use this as a starting point to then go back out onto Main Street, look at the town, have a deeper appreciation. You can see the various things from maps of what the buildings were proposed to be, and how they actually came to be, as well as some of the many photographs, as well as the many books that we have here for sale. One of which, of course, which I always like to talk about, is my own book called Bitter Melon. It's for sale here. We really encourage you to buy, if you're going to buy books like this, please buy them here and not on Amazon. I mean, you know, Amazon's great, but it also helps here. It helps the foundation. The foundation also has t-shirts, brochures, and many kinds of source material for you to discover and use here during your experience here in Locke. So there you go. Thank you. Well, now that we're upstairs in the Boarding House Museum, we're currently in between shows, and of course this is COVID land, so everything's been a little bit slow. We're prepping, the Locke Foundation is prepping this for their next show, which is going to be around what people wore, the various like dresses and such. In the corner over here we have one of the old sewing machines of how, you know, things were put together. Here we have some of the dresses that women would wear. And so it's kind of this work in progress here for the Boarding House Museum. You know, I realized that, you know, one of the things about having a museum here is why, you know, what makes Locke so special? Well, Locke has actually been recognized as it's won the National Register of Historical Landmarks. as well as on the National Register of Historical Places. Now, to give you a little bit of that in context, if I may have these figures a little bit wrong, so please bear with me, but I believe there are a little over 2,000 on the National Register of Historical Places for California. You'll see them, like on roadside markers and such, an historical example that you're asked to stop and look at. But Locke is also on the National Register of Historical Landmarks, which is a very high level of designation, in that I believe there's 149 of those designated places here in California. So historically, as well as for the experience of being a Californian, this is one of those rarefied places. Locke has essentially the same value as the Golden Gate Bridge, Hearst Castle, the state capitol. It's right up there, and that's why the whole experience of Locke and the experience of the Chinese in Locke and the whole Delta as a whole really needs to be told and to be experienced. That's why we encourage, when we're post-COVID, to please come down, look at all this. And so when you do come here, start downstairs, look at Main Street, start downstairs here, come upstairs and see the displays. Hopefully this will be, ready for you to look at, see this, see the gowns that people wore, look at the displays. We do have some really interesting displays that we're going to walk you through here in just a short bit to show you what, a typical kind of room that you would have, because remember, this was a boarding house, and so the men who would come to work in the fields or to work in the packing shed, this was a place that they would come to. Oftentimes you would have a shared room. In other words, one man would be staying here while he wasn't working. Another man, when he went back to work, would come and stay in that same room. It was a very much of an ongoing kind of very transient kind of workforce. You had, of course, you always had in Locke the residents who were full-time here. But for much of Locke, it was it would draw people in, the workers and such, but then the history, also that unique history that Locke had to it of the various social activities, which is a kind word, but gambling, prostitution, opium, and then of course during Prohibition, you had the speakeasy here. And one of the things that made Locke so unique was that, of course, because it was a totally freestanding Chinese community village to itself, it was one of those unique things that really separated this experience of having a community very different than, say, San Francisco's Chinese community or Sacramento's Chinese community, or even Isleton and even Walnut Grove, because all of those, you had the Chinese community that was either in the middle of or adjacent to an already existing city, town, community. Locke was its own community, and that's one of the reasons that it has that special designation of a landmark, because there's really no other town like that in California, and very few, if any, in America, where you had a complete town that had everything from restaurants to gasoline pumps, to stores, to everything that you would need in a community to be self-sufficient, you had right here in Locke. And that's part of the uniqueness that makes Locke so interesting to tell. Well, what we have here is where essentially you can see the two bunks here. So this was a shared room. Living was very simple. You worked really hard as a laborer out in the fields. Just imagine you're carrying around a wooden ladder that is maybe 10 feet, 12 feet high, that probably weighs maybe 30 pounds or so, and you have to balance it, and it's a race because you need to get as much fruit picked in a short amount of time as possible. So by the time the end of the day, you're exhausted. And generally in camps where you spent most of your time as you were working, of course you would come home, you'd come back to the camp, you would then be fed and dealt with. But then during the off seasons and such, you would come back to this here. You would probably have already established, one of the boarding rooms that you would traditionally always come back to and rent. And you would stay here for a period of time in between those agricultural jobs. But even here, you can see that it was very simple living. Probably on most of them, you would have, cutouts from magazines and calendars up on the walls and such. You can see some of those in my still photographs from my book, Bitter Melon and such. But it was, again, a really hard, simple life. For the Chinese, as well as many agricultural workers, you came here by yourself. And it was very much of a male-dominated society. There were very few women here in that time, particularly in agricultural areas. So that your daily life was about work. And trying to get enough money, trying to get money enough to send back to your family back in China. And also part of that was then it caused for an isolation by language, because you never got the chance in order to really learn English, because learning English was the real key to getting ahead in America here. But if you worked all day, you were exhausted at night, and many of the men who were here, particularly in Locke, never learned to speak English. Again, coming back to Bitter Melon and even the stories that you'll experience here in the boarding house museum, was about isolation and about that you stayed inside your own community, because if you went outside your community, you might you would not be received nicely, and so there was always a threat. So it kind of enhanced that thing of that you never really became a part of America in that sense. But hopefully, if you were to stay here and the people who were able to flourish, the merchants and such, you could develop this into a second and third and fourth generation to where we are now. But coming back to this room, this was very indicative of what it was like for them. And here we come to another example of, in a sense, a room. But this room, you might also just, even though it's here in the boarding house museum, you might now project this out to be on one of the ranches that actually had a physical structure for its workers. Some of the ranchers didn't. They, particularly early on, say at the turn of the century into the teens and into the 20s, oftentimes some of the workers just simply slept out into the orchard themselves. They had tents and such, and their cook would then have an outside kitchen for them. But some of the other ranchers had more facilities, like a building that was once used for something have turned into essentially a bunkhouse. And this might be what a bunkhouse room looked like, of where you would have a series of things in it and such. And that was, again, for the workers so that they wouldn't have to leave the ranch and work the entire pear season, because pears, not only need to be picked, but the trees need to be pruned in the winter. And the maintenance of those really required, an on-site workforce of some magnitude and such. And so, yeah, this is a good example of what a might look like out on one of the ranches for you. So again, this is all part of what you can experience when you come to Locke and come to the boarding house museum to take a look at this. You know, when we were out on Main Street, we tried to show you the various buildings and give you a sense of what the expanse of Main Street was like. But now that you're coming into here, you begin to kind of see what some of the interiors might have looked like. As we come down Main Street, I want to stop here. For me, this building symbolizes so much about the town of Locke. In one way, about what Locke, in a sense, was and wasn't. As we've said, in a sense before, that Locke was one of these unique places of where the Chinese constructed their own town. And it was highly exclusion. I mean, the Chinese who lived here really felt this was their town, their community, and that's what made it special. But here you have Al's place. What is an Italian restaurant doing in the middle of an all-Chinese town? Well, it goes back to this remarkable series of events that take place back in 1901. There's a steamship called the City of Rio de Janeiro. Its normal route was to go, it was a trans-Pacific steamer. It would go all the way over to Asia, China, Japan, and such, and come back to America, landing in San Francisco. It had mostly an all-Chinese crew, as well as most of the passengers were Chinese. And this was, again, 1901. Well, on the day of February the 22nd, the ship had approached the entrance to San Francisco Bay the night before, but the fog was so thick that the pilot and the captain decided that they would anchor off of San Francisco and wait for the fog to lift the next day on the 22nd. Well, the fog lifts in the early morning, but then as the ship gets underway, the fog settles back down. And possibly because the compass wasn't deviated correctly, they run into where Fort Point is, right there at the entrance to San Francisco Bay. It strikes the rocks, it backs back out, but it starts taking on water immediately and starts to sink. It's documented as the largest loss of life in a maritime accident in all of San Francisco Bay's history. Most of the people died, but a few were rescued. And one of the people who rescued a number of the Chinese was a fellow by the name of Alessandro Adami. He was an Italian fisherman who had come to America. He was an immigrant. And the Italians at that time were pretty well looked down upon, but so were the Chinese. In fact, you know, because of the kind of animosity between immigrants at that point, and everybody had their own little areas, if you were a Chinese and you went into North Beach in San Francisco, you would be probably severely beaten, if not killed. There was that kind of animosity. But Alessandro, seeing these people in the water, said, I can't allow these people to drown. So he rescues them. He brings them to shore. He becomes a hero, not only to the Chinese community, but to all of San Francisco. He was given a plaque by the Italian Bank of America to commemorate his heroic deeds. So by 1920 or so, Alessandro's oldest son, Al Jr., let's just say, is a young, strapping man in North Beach, San Francisco. And it's an exciting time. You know, it's Prohibition. There's a lot of stuff happening. It's the Roaring 20s. Well, I've heard different stories, but one of the stories that I heard was Al had to flee San Francisco in the middle of the night, and using not only his own kind of familiarity with the Chinese, as well as the special place that the Adami family has, he comes to the Delta. And from what I understand, he first comes to Isleton, and he gets involved with some of the local activity here and such. And he gets to know the various, because, you know, the Chinese know about the Adami family. So by the 30s, he's kind of here in Locke and such. And that's one of those remarkable things that come back to echo about the about the immigrant experience here in America, in that you have the Italians who are one of those immigrants, and then you have the Chinese who are the other immigrants, and you have this town that was all Chinese. And so the owner of this place, this building here, Charlie Lee Bing, who, as I've said, was one of the major forces here in town. He owned a number of buildings. He was one of the driving forces that brought people here. I've said all that. But so he has this building, and he decides to, in a sense, make a tribute to the Adami family by offering Al this building, of course, which Al takes on. And that's how this becomes this Italian restaurant in this all Chinese town. And to me, that really spoke about the best things about America, in that we help each other out. We become a more when we can share something, whether it be a building or to save a life, we build ourselves up as a totality. And that's one of the great things about Locke and being part of this remarkable experience here in the Delta and California and America as a whole. And when you come to Main Street Locke here, which we highly encourage you to do, please come into Al's. Take a look. It's one of those unique buildings. There's a mural inside painted by an itinerant muralist who painted this horse scene from, something from the Wild West and such. But then you'll see all the dollar bills up on the ceiling. It's a remarkable place. And then you get to know the backstory of how this building comes to be. This is an exciting story for all of us to understand and to be appreciative, and what a building this is. And here we are on Main Street. Again, what an experience this town is, and for you to come visit and to take a look at this. Every single building here has a story to be told. And as we go through and tells the stories, and you can make up your own stories of what it would be like to be here in Locke, say in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and so on. So, Al's Place, remarkable. Well, now we step into what is the Dai Loy Museum. The Dai Loy Gambling Hall was one of a few that Charlie Lee Bing, who was, as we said, was one of the founders of Locke. Well, this was one of, I believe he had 6 gambling establishments here in town, as well as others in Marysville and Yuba City, I believe, and some others. He was a very successful entrepreneur in the American spirit of making do with what you get. And so Charlie Lee Bing started the buildings, this one particularly, this gambling den, because one of the things that Lee Bing did was very different than the rest of the various Chinese gambling establishments up and down the Sacramento River. In that early on, in fact, there's even a 1919 expose done by the Sacramento Bee, which was one of the major newspapers in Sacramento at the time. They sent down an investigative reporter, a fellow by the name of Leslie Davies, to come down and to figure out why all of a sudden there was all this added activity that was happening in the town of Locke. Now remember, as we've already said, Locke was started in 1915, but this is 1919, just a few years later. And already the reports in Sacramento that they're getting is that gambling is taken off in Locke. And so Leslie Davies comes down here and he stops in Cortland and he goes to Walnut Grove, and I think he even went down to Isleton, but then he was here in Locke. And he says the thing that made Locke so different than all the other Chinese establishments along the Delta here was that, and he says it right there in his lead paragraph, he calls Locke the Monte Carlo of California. And what you have is what so the difference was that in all these other towns, the only game that a non-Chinese person or Filipino would be allowed to come in and play. In other words, the white community was allowed to play were the various lotteries. But they couldn't come in here, and as you can see by these tables, all the other fan-tan, poker, all these other games of chance that you might have. If you were a Caucasian, you couldn't get in to play those games and all the other things. But Li Bing had this idea to allow everybody to come in and partake of the possibilities of self-enrichment, let's say, okay? And so Leslie Davies, and this is what's amazing, Leslie Davies in this article says that the uniqueness of Locke was attributed to allowing Americans to be able to come and gamble. Americans. Well, the thing was, remember, because of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, if you were Chinese, you were not allowed to become a US citizen. And there was even some controversy that had to go to the Supreme Court that allowed, if you were born here from Chinese parents for a time, you were still not considered to be an American, but that was overruled. But if you were to come from China, at that time, you could not be considered to be even an American. So that was the importance of that headline. So Li Bing had this unique idea that his business model was to include everybody, because he said that why exclude the possibility of taking, because gambling was pretty profitable for the house, which it was. Stories that I've been told from people a while ago, he told me that a particular dealer would take home like $10,000 in an evening and keep it until he could get it to wherever the money that was going to be stored the next day. That was the amount of money that flowed through here. And the reason, of course, was that you had so many people coming here to be able to gamble. The place would be packed. I know it looks awfully quiet here tonight, and it's definitely suffered from aging. You can kind of see as I'm walking, I get higher and lower. It feels like I'm, on a ship. I'm in the middle of an ocean being thrust about. But no, that's the flooring. It suffered from a bit of the aging. But as you can see all about you, all of this was part of this huge amount of activity. This place would be packed. And you can see, the doors would be heavily bolted and such. You had bars up on the windows and such. You had a buzzer that was on the outside that you always had a watch person out there. And if by chance there was a raid that happened, most of the raids were already known, they had an idea, and then you'd have the watch person out there and they would hit a buzzer, and then everybody would either go away or become like, oh, we're just friendly playing with, cards and such. No, there's no gambling happening here. But that was the genius of Li Bing. And it was like anything like that. You have rivalries, sometimes turning quite violent, as well as you have people who were, crooks that would come. And there was actually a very famous incident of where you had a couple of Caucasian guys from all the way up in Klamath River coming down here to gamble. And they just, at one point, they steal all the money off of one of the dealer's tables. Well, the dealer runs out after them, and his assistant runs out after them. Well, the assistant has a pistol, and he ends up killing one of the guys out there on Main Street. He's sent to prison and for murder and such. But this was a different time. Well, maybe, who knows how different, but so Li Bing, whose personal lawyer, a fellow by the name of Luke Howe, who happened to be the years before, he was the district attorney for Sacramento County. So he knew everybody, he knew all the judges. He becomes the personal lawyer for Li Bing. I've heard stories from his Li Bing's grandchildren talking about their grandfather, being in this big, I think it was a Cadillac or LaSalle or one of those fancy cars of the time, and being told these stories of how Luke Howe, Li Bing's personal lawyer, was always there for him. Well, one of the things that Luke Howe was able to do, of course, was to massage the system. And within a few years, the dealer's assistant who shot this guy was then paroled and gotten a lighter sentence, and he comes back to Locke years later. But that was kind of the power of Li Bing. And this building here is so much a part of that. So when you come to Locke, we've kind of walked through the town. We have the boarding house museum. We have Al's, and then you have this here where you can actually come in and get a sense of what the gambling must have been like. Imagine though that this was all smoke filled, of course, and you had tea that was here and people moving back and forth, and of course you had, during Prohibition, you had liquor that was flowing. You would have this place coming and going with people. And as you move around here, be sure to go into all the little back rooms that we have here, and you can look about. There's so much to see in the single building here that you can take back with you, with the richness of all this history. I mean, and then you can see how, through the photographs and through the various displays here, to get a real sense of taking you back into that magical time of Locke in the late teens and the 20s. And it, of course, changes in the 30s because of the Depression and the retraction of the economy. And then, of course, into the 40s of when all those young men and women who had grown up in this town and looking at their future with oftentimes very little possibility of really enjoying the magic of being in America, of given an opportunity to be able to go to school and to achieve all those kinds of things that they wanted. And that happens because all those young men and women fought in World War II. They were highly patriotic. They went and they flew airplanes. They were on the battlefields. They were support. They helped out tremendously. And of course, after the war, they were able to take advantage of the GI Bill to where they didn't have to come back and in a sense, try to fit into an America that was for so many years really hostile to them. Like the story that, is told through Bing Fai Chow and how he never felt safe when he left Locke because he knew that he would be attacked. But when he'd come back to Locke, he would call it our town because he felt safe here. And that's what Locke was. It was this refuge for people. But it also has this whole other side to it, like so many other immigrant experiences of where you have to make do, given that all the opportunities aren't always open to you. It may take some time. So during that time, that initial time of when you're here, it's like Li Bing, who was very smart. He came over here as a very young man, and he learned English, and he learned he was obviously quite brilliant, and looked at the landscape in front of him and realized that in order to be ahead in America, he had to be, in a sense, going against what was legally possible at the time. So he ran these gambling establishments. But from those gambling establishments, he was able to support how many families and how many other people from this, and was able then to build upon that. So his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren are now so embedded into the great fabric of America that this gives you the beginning to see how that fabric, that tapestry is woven into the greatness that the American experience can provide. And here we are looking at the fundamentals of this first steps in getting ahead. Well, here we come into what's called the money room. And, this is just one of the many little rooms here in the Dai Loy Museum, but it kind of gives you a sense of what this was like. And I really, when you come here, please take some time to just spend some time looking at the little things, like how the door is, how the locking mechanisms were here like this. And then, of course, look at the photos, but really just look around the ceiling. I mean, this beadboard. This was how every single building in Locke was on the interior. This kind of tongue and groove building, which was indicative to the entire town. And as you go back out, you'll see how high each of the walls were. This was very typical of many of the buildings. Most of them, even in the boarding houses and even in the smaller buildings, they generally had 14-foot high ceilings. So, and generally most of them, if they were a boarding house, you would see that they have a long corridor down the middle and then with individual rooms off to the side. But one of the commercial establishments like this here for the Dai Loy Museum was, of course, you have these little compartments of where things were. And because this was the money room, you needed to keep it secured. So notice the bars on the windows and the bars on the door and how all this was. And of course, the safe. So this gives you a pretty good idea of just one of this. But then there are the rooms too. Please, when you come walk around, really take your time and enjoy all of this that has to offer. So the school was started in 1926 by money from I forget his guy's name, but he had started the dollar stores. And he was a Chinese guy and he started this idea that a dollar store, in a sense. He became quite wealthy, and he donated money in order to start a school here, a Chinese school. So that in 1926 was the commemoration for that. There's a picture of where it's a panoramic picture, meaning it's 180 degrees, of a large congregation of almost entirely Chinese who are there to commemorate the beginning of the school. And for the kids who grew up here in Locke, the school was, in a sense, a way of supporting the Chinese co-experience with being here in America, so that the kids would go to school in Walnut Grove to what was then called the other school, because at that point you had this beautiful brick building, the Gene Harvey School as we call it now, that was there for essentially the white community of Walnut Grove and the surrounding areas. But then you had this wooden building of where the non-whites would go, the Chinese, the Filipinos and such, would go for schooling. But then the Chinese kids from Locke would then come back at the 3 o'clock or so and then have to go to Chinese school for 2 hours a day. And since some of them liked it, and many of them thought, God, I gotta go to school after going to school. But, and so they would learn calligraphy, they learned basically, Chinese history and such. And so that was the school. And it was still, when I lived here in the 70s too, some of the younger kids were still going to Chinese school on a kind of a regular basis to practice Chinese calligraphy, to learn to write and various things like that. But that was the school. It was oftentimes used for us in the 70s as a place to meet with the various state organizations and county organizations as they put forth their plans about what the possibilities of Locke might be into the future. But that was the school itself. Well, we've now come down Key Street. And this is, it runs parallel to Main Street where we started, just over there for us. But now back here, Key Street was the residential side of Locke. And for me personally, I lived on Main Street for a couple of years, but it wasn't until I moved back here to Key Street. Actually, in this house right here, it was a yellow house back then. But I was able to, through just pure luck and such, I was able to live back here. And it was living back here that Locke really transformed for me. It became community. I really never felt part of Locke when I lived out on Main Street. It was kind of like I was just a visitor. But moving back here, that was different. All of a sudden, it was like, yeah, this is where everybody was living, here, back here. And then something also remarkable happened. My neighbor who lived in this house over here her name was Jong Ho Leong, and she lived with her husband in this house here. And the porch did not have this picket fence here back then, but it was kind of open. And she came over shortly after I moved in. And, in her pidgin English and, kind of, pointing and gesturing, I left my place and she had me follow her back to where that little porch is back there. And she brought me in there and she showed me this bathroom that was in kind of decay and such. And I kind of got it, that she asked me to, if I could help her fix it. So sure, I can help you do that. So it was and that really transformed Locke for me, helping Mrs. Leong out. And because in the evenings, as kind of a payback for my working, repairing the toilet, doing some plumbing, rebuilding this and such, she would bring me into her house and feed me. These wonderful meals, very simple, just a Chinese, rice gruel almost with some, with vegetables and maybe a little meat or a little, smoked fish or something. She also introduced me to Bitter Melon, which, coming back to my book, or in the book that I wrote with Jeff, we thought that was the most appropriate title. But yeah, I first tasted Bitter Melon from her. But it was also through her that I really became a part of the community, as well as being able to make those images that I did. I really owe it all to her. Because even though she allowed me, initially after a little bit of time, to photograph her as she was doing things, like you'll see in my book, her in her kitchen preparing food, and her husband and such, and she's, kind of reflected in the mirror with some of her photos of her children and such. But it wasn't really the kinds of portraiture that we would know as a portrait. There was no like, okay, I'm going to bring up my camera and I'm going to take a picture of you. No, that was something that still felt not right. But then there was one afternoon, I was picking some flowers for a girlfriend, some roses actually, from I had a series of roses over in my yard there. And Mrs. Leong was sitting right there on her porch. It was a warm summer day. And she's sitting outside. Well, I just happened to give her some flowers. And then she looked at me, because I always had my camera back then. And she then just said, okay, take my picture. And that was the real first frontal portrait that I did in Locke. And that opened up everything. Then my other neighbors said, oh, sure, you can take my photo. And then because, if you help out people, that idea of sharing, a skill or ability that you have, I was able to, help my elderly neighbors out when, say, it was a cold winter day and pipes would break. We go over and fix them and help out in that way. And so from that, we were able to come back, in the 80s and do these oral histories and learning about Jong Ho's story, which I had no idea about. And you can hear her, in the pages of Bitter Melon, telling about how she had to flee China in the late 30s to get the Japanese were bombing, and she was on a bus that was almost bombed. She had to flee, and eventually she comes here to America. And how hard it was for her to be able to come here and to work and to be able to essentially prosper in this community. Her husband, who had been injured in an accident with machinery, he couldn't work, and so all of it depended upon on Mrs. Leong going off and doing jobs that she didn't really want to do, or it was very hard physical work, working in a cannery year after year to just get enough money in order to survive for her. But this was her house. This was where all the So Young lived a crossover in this house, he and his wife and his children. And everybody would be sitting out on the porches in the warm evenings, and it was so delightful for me as a young man to be here and watching all my elderly Chinese have this most remarkable life. And I think that's one of the things that drew me back here when I retired, that I wanted to live back in Locke, because Locke was always, in a sense, so special and so comforting and just delightful to be here. In a bit, we'll go back to the gardens where the Chinese had phenomenal gardens here, where they were always putting something into the ground and always taking something out and then drying it and storing it, and just it was truly remarkable back then to be a part of this community and looking at all of this, and just right here. And of course, living back here, oftentimes Main Street felt like miles away. We who live back here on Key Street, why go to Main Street when we have so much back here? So this is Key Street. Enjoy.